Hello and welcome to Black, Brown, and Bilingue, where our mission is to unite the Black and Brown communities through education, storytelling, and community engagement.
The vision of Black, Brown, and Bilingue is to be part of creating a world in which Black and Brown identities are affirmed, bilingualism and biculturalism are nurtured, and equity is the driving force behind all that we do. Thank you for joining us again today. I am Lisette Jacobson, and I am one of your hosts.
And I'm Maurice McDavid. I'm your other host.
So again, our guest today is Dr. Paul Ortiz. Dr. Paul Ortiz is a first-generation college student, third-generation military veteran, and he is a professor of history and director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. He is president of the United Faculty of Florida, AFL-CIO, recipient of the Cesar Chavez Award, Florida Education Association. He is a former organizer with the United Farm Workers of Washington State and Farm Labor Organizing Committee. His book, which is very well known and just life-changing, really, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, was recently included on the list of 850 books targeted by Texas lawmakers because they might make students feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress because of their race or sex. We're going to get into all of that today. Dr. Paul Ortiz, thank you so much for joining us on Black, Brown, and Bilingue.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here. I'm excited.
Quick question before we jump in, though. My husband is also a veteran. Which military branch?
So I'm a third-generation military veteran, and so I was actually in the 82nd Airborne Division and 7th Special Forces in the mid-'80s in Central America.
Wow.
And my father was actually recruited to take part in the Bay of Pigs invasion. Didn't go. He actually also met Fidel Castro, by the way. My father's pretty remarkable. But my elders who fled here during the Mexican Revolution in 1914 also began serving in the military. So we've had people from World War I, World War II. My great uncle was a war hero in the Pacific, but he came back just really shattered and died very shortly after. They called it survivor's guilt. And then, of course, I had, in-laws and family who were in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I grew up mainly in a town called Bremerton, Washington, which is a shipyard town. So a lot of people in the Navy and the Marines. My father retired from the Navy. And so war was all we knew. I mean, growing up, everyone on my block, when people would talk about, young men coming home in body bags, the tail end of the Vietnam War, those young men were my best friends, fathers or older brothers or things like that. And so, we hear that this phrase a lot in the Chicano community growing up. Same thing in the Black communities, and the phrase was, things were much better before the war, and you'd hear that over and over again. And you as kids, though, we'd wonder, like, when would that have been? Because,
Right.
We were always sent to fight something, and so my war just happened to be in Central America, and so I was a soldier of empire, but it was the beginning of a series of epiphanies and wake-up calls. Number one, like, what was I doing, in Honduras and all these other places? And because when I got home and I would tell people what was up, they'd say, "Oh no, Paul, you were down there helping us avoid a Castro-style revolution." And I said, "Brother, if you think that, then I got some cheap swampland in Florida to sell you, because that's not at all what was happening." And so it was it really spurred me to try to figure out, what's going on here in this society that people are so duped, including myself.
That is so interesting. We often talk about just some of like the heroes that white children in the education system get exposed to, and a lot, that military background, but you really don't hear about like Chicanos that were in the armed forces. You've also used the phrase like radical history. Can you explain to our listeners what this is, and does that tie into your military background at all, or kind of can you tell us a little bit more about that?
It does, because I didn't find this out until years later, but the people who really were in the forefront of creating radical history, every Chicano just about that was in the academy up until the late 90s was a military veteran that I knew. And so many military veterans, and now we're talking about people like, say, Frantz Fanon or E.P. Thompson or Howard Zinn. And the list goes on. And it's no mistake that those individuals who saw military, combat, saw the interior of the empire, if you will. They saw so when I was in Central America, we were doing just really bad things. I mean, that's all I can say is that we were there supposedly, promoting democracy. Well, I was a 20-year-old sergeant in the U.S. Special Forces. I had never voted in my entire life. I never even voted in a school board election. So how was I going to be promoting democracy? And so that I didn't wake up. I don't want to give you the impression that all of a sudden I woke up one day and said, hey, we need to get radical to change this thing. But the idea of doing radical history, when I got home to the U.S., home in quotes, to the U.S. in 1987, the first book that someone put in my hands was by Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States. And they said, hey, this was written by a fellow veteran. This is a person you can trust. And so I just got hooked right away to this idea of radical history, where you go to the root, you go to the source of the problem, and you say, if you have misogyny, if you have white supremacy, then you deal with it as a system. You try to root it out as a system. You try to understand how the system was created. You don't do it one at a time kind of thing, like how they do in bourgeois societies. And they'll say, well, like in the late 60s, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. helped create the Poor People's Campaign, he said this whole idea of rooting out poverty one person at a time is morally corrupt. He said, why don't we just work to abolish poverty across the board? And that was a radical solution to poverty. And so that's really what I guess I mean by radical history, is if we want to get to the root of both the problems, but also the solutions as well. The radical social movements, whether you're talking about the Chicana movement, the Black Power movement, the Puerto Rican Liberation movement, the farm worker movement, these are the reasons we have what we have right now.
Sure.
And so I wanted that book, An African American Latinx History of the United States, to honor experiences that our elders and ancestors had in bringing us what we have today, instead of the same old nonsense. I mean, now that I think about my understanding of history, Lizette, before I got into becoming a historian, it's rather embarrassing, I have to say.
Yeah.
I mean,
you were a product of the system, though, weren't you?
Right. Yeah. We read about these people like Alexander Hamilton and how grateful we were supposed to be to him. And then we actually read his words, what he said about Native people, what he said about people who are not rich. You're like, wow, he really didn't like any of us. And so you're like, but that's what the system pushes us to do, to humiliate ourselves.
Yes.
And so we still have people of color running around talking about how much they owe or we owe to Adams or Hamilton or Jefferson, when they had nothing but contempt for us. I mean, their words drip with contempt. I mean, when I was doing research, and look, I'm not saying you replace them and you take them out of the history books, because they should be there. If you're doing a U.S. history from 1776 to present, Jefferson should be there, Hamilton should be there, but put them in the proper light. Make sure people know like what they really thought and did. And then get them to understand there's a big difference between Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton. The difference is that Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention is like, hey, y'all, we got to end slavery now. He said, it took me a long time to get to this point, but I'm like, we got to end this right now. And all the other so-called founding fathers were like, Mr. Franklin, you're getting on in age a little bit, maybe you just need to just go back to sleep or something. So
Go
that
take
was
a nap.
go take a nap. I mean, yeah. So that was part of what I was trying to do with African American Latinx history, is to restore agency to the founding fathers. Give props where they deserve. Let's talk about Thomas Paine. I wish Brother Miranda would have done a musical on Brother Thomas Paine.
I was just about to say that. Or maybe Ben
Yeah.
Franklin, right? Come
Or
on,
even
Paul,
Franklin.
let's get
Thank
on
you.
it.
Even Franklin. Yeah.
So
Why Hamilton?
right.
It is hard, Paul, because we're big fans of the musical
We
as
definitely
as
are.
a production.
Love the soundtrack. Love it. Yeah.
Yes. So I do want to follow up with one more question though, because I, like you, I grew up and I went through the American public school system and essentially felt invisible as a Chicana. If you were lucky, you got like a couple of lessons on Cesar Chavez and that was it. And so a lot of the learning that I had to go back and do was my own like research. And one of the most profound like documentaries and books was John Perkins. I don't know if you're familiar, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and how the United States goes into other countries, particularly in Latin America, under the guise of spreading democracy and providing aid, but eventually just indebting those countries to the United States indefinitely because they will never be able to repay the loans or whatever services are given. And when we hear things like particularly immigration from Latin American countries, people don't understand that history, right? Like, how did we arrive to this point? Could you speak to that a little bit?
I just finished teaching my Latino history survey at the University of Florida. And the last book we read is Junot Diaz's book, The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. And Brief and Wondrous Life is a beautiful book. My students, they take ownership of that book. I have a lot of Dominican students, and the Dominican students especially, but other students from the Latinx diaspora take ownership too, because it's truly a book about diaspora. I mean, you mentioned earlier Cesar Chavez. So a lot of my training that allowed me to write this book was through the United Farm Workers and getting to know Dolores Huerta and these other incredible leaders. I was never lucky enough to get to know Cesar, but my wife met him when she was 15 years old.
Oh, wow.
She grew up on a farm in Homestead, Florida. And so she got hooked in the movement for life. I joined later after I got out of the military, and I met Dolores. And I've actually done 2 oral histories with her. And to me, she is one of the most significant Americans in our entire history. And I require my students every time she comes down here, that you have to go, because this is not like, not like I'm saying, oh, she's just a historical icon, but she lives this life where she's saying, hey, we need to step it up for LGBT people, for trans people, for all people who are oppressed. We can't just be about us folks, and about our own thing. And so she was continues to be a great teacher. And I've lost the thread to your question, Liz.
No, you're okay. No, it's about, just even how do we end up in the situation where people end up coming to the United States and the economic hitman, the Confessions, the book by John Perkins.
Well, in Brief and Wondrous Life, I mean, that's a book which talks about, it begins in Patterson, the Dominican community in Patterson, communities. And then it takes us back to the U.S. support for the Trujillo regime, the vicious tortures. The reason that so many people from the DR come to the U.S. is because of U.S. support for imperialism and dictatorship in the DR. And that's what Juan Gonzalez calls the harvest of empire. And the reason my family came is that, I mean, we're still trying to piece this together, but our family literally fled Mexico the same week that the U.S. Marines invaded Tampico and went to occupied U.S. oil fields, which were being threatened with nationalization in 1914. And so many of us, whether we're from Cuba, Mexico, the DR, Haiti, we arrived here because of U.S. interventions in those countries. When I came back home in '86, I was shocked, Lisette, because so many of my friends would say, Paul, you were down there. Why are all these Hondurans in East Los Angeles? Why are all these Salvadorans in Seattle or Tacoma? And I would say, you don't know, man.
Right.
I said, your country is fueling these civil wars. It's making their living conditions in Nicaragua and Honduras and Colombia impossible. They can't live there anymore. And so they have to move north, or it's a trade agreement. And I think Juan Gonzalez in Harvest of Empire is really good about talking about war, but also the trade agreements are maybe even a bigger factor because, you passed NAFTA in 1994. And I remember in the farm worker movement, we fought NAFTA tooth and nail. I mean, we got arrested, we got chased by the police. I remember Jesse Jackson was there with us on the picket line. I remember Bill Clinton betrayed us, and the
Sure did, didn't he?
Yeah. And we were not economists, but we were told by Mexican farmers that if it passed, and they were telling us this in 91, 92, that if it passed, that it was going to wipe out small farming in Mexico. And in fact, that's what it did. It did to small farming in Mexico, talking about NAFTA, what banks did to small farmers in the US in the 1890s and 1910s. That's why small farming in this country became untenable. The same thing they did to the small farmers in Kansas in the 1910s, banks did to small farmers in Mexico in the 1990s, or in Haiti. I mean, even just as bad or worse, flooding a nation of small farmers with the same commodities that those small farmers grow, especially rice. And so years later, Bill Clinton comes back and he issues, I guess it was an apology. I apologize for pushing this trade agreement, but that trade agreement against Haiti caused thousands of Haitian small farmers to have to leave the land and either move to the cities in Haiti or then migrate to the US. The same thing happens in the British Empire or the French Empire. The same thing. You go to London today, you'll find a lot of people from the former British West Indies or the French West Indies, Martinique, Guadeloupe, so on and so forth, in Paris or in Marseille. It's an imperial thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I was aware to some degree, right, that the trade agreements played that role, but really to hear some of those other pieces too is really impactful. Particularly, we've talked a little bit about how fights against things like that have been partnered with the NAACP, and how sometimes there's this idea of competition, right, between the NAACP or other Black organizations and our Latinx organizations and some of those pieces. In fact, we've got another episode, and we talked with Nicholas C. Vaca about that Black-Brown divide as a concept. Now, I'd love to get there, or just perhaps get your thoughts there on, as you wrote this book called The African American and Latinx History of the United States, right? Were there times where these two groups were coming together? Were there times where they've kind of been at odds with one another?
Yeah, well, I mean, let me start by saying, I'm a big fan of Nick Vaca's work. I mean, he's obviously a great icon and a great, elder intellectual. I've learned so much. And there's a lot of great literature that talks directly about tensions between the movements. You alluded to even, within African-American civil rights organizations, SNCC, CORE, SCLC, NAACP, Urban League, et cetera, et cetera. When I was growing up, frankly, within the Chicano community, there was probably more tensions between Mexicans and Puerto Ricans than there was between Mexicans and Black people.
That's a whole nother episode.
Yeah. And so I think it depends on what angle you're coming from. I don't want to duck the question, but I'll take a step back. So what I was most concerned of in writing an African-American and Latinx history of the US was first to make sure that we placed Haiti, Mexico, and Cuba at the center of US history, for starters. And I believed I could make the argument that those three nations should be at the centerpiece, not just starting in 1959 or the year the Black Panthers or the Young Lords started in the late 60s, but let's start in 1776 and let's talk about the centrality of Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa to US history. Now, keep in mind, I only had 200 pages. The wonderful people at Beacon Press said, Paul, no one reads 500-page books, only you historians, right? And so I'd leave a lot of things out, but I really wanted to start by centering and not taking white people out of the picture, but placing Mexico, placing people like Jose Maria Morelos at the center, placing Toussaint Louverture at the center, placing the Cuban Liberation War against the Spanish Empire, because I could see, my keys to learning were people in the Black abolitionist movement in the 1810s and 1820s. They were the ones who kind of, recentered my understanding of these freedom struggles, frankly. And oftentimes the freedom struggles that were taking place happen on parallel lines. And so, for example, in my chapter on Reconstruction in the book, it's clear that actually the largest Black national movement at the time is a movement created in solidarity with the Cuban liberation struggle. And there were many African Americans in New York, people like Henry Highland Garnett. He was English-Spanish bilingual. He was in close contact with Antonio Maceo and other leaders of the Cuban liberation movement. So that was one long-term example of kind of Black-brown solidarity in that classic sense, where you're sometimes even in the same movement spaces, right? There was a physical address in the Bowery, where people would meet, immigrants from Cuba, former African-American abolitionists, and that was a moment of solidarity that I thought was important to talk about. But you're right. I mean, also moments of great tension as well. Look, capitalism is the system that's created, that we have to work with, is created as a zero-sum game. And we're told to compete against each other. And I remember as a kid, I grew up in the backlash era in the 70s. And I was living in the East Bay in California. And every other news show that was on, it would be an angry, oftentimes white person talking about how the Blacks and the Mexicans had gained too many rights at the expense of white people. And it was, Clint Eastwood was everywhere, the Dirty Harry movies and everything, right? But it was very eye-opening as a young boy. And I remember we would walk to school in San Leandro, and I would walk from Marina Boulevard to Garfield Elementary School. And there were just a very few Black and brown kids, and we would kind of huddle together, and white adults would drive by us and throw things at us, man. They would throw like beer cans, and for some reason, Budweiser. I don't even like Budweiser to this day because I associate with the people throwing cans, and they would yell at us. They would say, "Go back, go back to your home, go back where you belong." And as fourth graders, we would think, well, man, we can't go back home. We get into trouble with our parents. We're supposed to be going to school. And as we got a little older, we realized, no, they were saying, go back to Mexico, go back to Africa. And the other thing that they would say over and over again was, you people lost the war, get over it. And that was so confusing to me because I grew up with a lot of different wars in mind. And again, as I get a little older, I'm like, oh, damn, they're talking about the Mexican-American War.
Yes.
You people lost the war, get over it. And there was some kind of mindset among Anglos, not all of them, but the ones who seemed to be angry and dominated so much of our lives that, it was just a very intense time to grow up in. But my time in the farm worker movement, I learned how both to create social movements, but also how fragile they could be. The Rainbow Coalition was a great example because at its best, the Rainbow Coalition was this big tent that encompassed LGBT, Chicano, Puerto Rican, Black, anti-apartheid, organizers. And, we'd often do things together. But then other times, especially when it got to electoral politics, sometimes for some reason we would kind of spiral apart and it'd say, well, the Rainbow's supporting this person. And the labor people would be like, well, we don't like that person, and then we would clash. But I'll remember, I'll never forget. I just think we owe such a great debt in the farm worker movement to Jesse Jackson. And that debt will never be repaid. Reverend Jackson is the last person, to my knowledge, who went to the presidential, the Democratic National Convention and used his speech to support the farm worker movement. He would tell people boycott grapes or boycott. I think the year he's
yes,
right, and he would use those platforms to support workers' movements. And it was such a great lift for us, especially when we'd see the mainstream of the Democratic Party in the 90s moving away and saying, well, we need a new Democratic Party. We need to be much more open to the upwardly mobile, affluent people in Silicon Valley or Upper Manhattan or something like that. So yeah, the coalition thing, the coalitions were often fragile. So that was something that was interesting to learn.
Maurice and I have talked at great lengths about this idea because we're educators, right? We are elementary school principals. And so, and Maurice is actually a former history teacher. And we talk about how ill-prepared teachers are to teach this radical history. And one of the biggest things that I always talk about again is feeling largely invisible, but seeing Black history as a source of inspiration. However, now, as I got older and became an educator, I saw what a disservice we did to Black children in teaching history, right? Because we always just show them slavery. And even maybe this is just a controversial thought that has crossed my mind, but I think that the way that slavery and just the Black experience has been taught in the United States does more harm to the psyche of Black children than not being represented at all. Like it was almost better for me, like as I look back, like, would they have done my history justice? Would I have walked around with, this feeling of, I don't know, inferiority or whatever, had they included it more? What are your thoughts on that? Like, do you think it was better to be left out than to be terribly represented?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I'll give you an example from Mexico. And so, Mexico in many ways has an excellent educational system, depending on where you're at. It's like any large country. There's some places where it's really strong, other places, not quite so strong. Mm-hmm. When it comes time to commemorate the War of Independence and Mexican independence in September, every September, we have the same debate year after year. I'll use the term radical. How radical should the celebration be? Because on its surface in Mexico City, we ring the bells and there's this idea that, oh, this was a great day. We gained our independence from the mother country, but there's very little talk about imperialism or slavery. And especially there's not talk much about, well, who actually led the War of Independence? Like who even fought it? And because they fought it, it was a race war. It was a war against slavery. It was a war against the oppression of indigenous peoples. And when my students in the US, because I've worked with a lot of first generation students from Mexico who are the products of good educations in Mexico, but then they come to the US and they take my Latinx history 101 course and they're like, wow, no one ever told us that half of our freedom fighters were Black and indigenous peoples. And they were generals that led white people into battle. Like we never learned that. And that the first day of the cry for independence, there were a lot of them said death to white people. And they meant it too. They weren't just messing around because they saw Europeans as the key source of their oppression and their bondage, whether they were really in bondage as slaves or whether they're in bondage as indigenous people. So this is kind of an elliptical response to your question, Lizette. I think that, teach slavery. But if you place, what a difference if you can place Harriet Tubman at the center of the story instead of people who are in bondage and have no hope and everything, or placing Frederick Douglass or the Mexico corollary, Jose Morelos, or the freedom fighters. That's how I see, because I agree 100% with Malcolm X's insights on this too, because Malcolm had much the same critique that you did about the ways in which, young Black children were being taught. They're being taught that, oh, we only had a history of slavery. That's why when I was an outside expert reviewer for the Connecticut standards on African-American, on what they call Black and Latino histories. So in Connecticut now, you are required to graduate from Connecticut public schools. You must take a sequence in Black and Latino Puerto Rican histories. That's a requirement, not an elective. And so this is an issue that we kicked around and debated and dialogued. And we said, we've got to make sure that that the children understand the incredible cultural agency, the economic agency, the fights for freedom and emancipation, the wars, and those had to be in there too, so that people didn't just see Black and brown people as passive victims.
Right.
You know what I mean?
There was resistance, there was joy, people were getting married, they were, and Maurice is really passionate about that. Go ahead, I know you want to jump in. Like, there was still resistance. People were finding ways to stick it to the man.
Yeah, I'm trying to monitor because my dog is also barking in the background here. But I definitely wanted to jump in just because I think it's so important, right, that we talk about the fact that these people were not passive, right? They were not sitting around allowing this to happen to them, and that resistance definitely plays a major role. And I don't think I heard any of that. And even as a young history teacher, I came in and I elevated Black and brown people, right? And I elevated women in the conversation, but I think I'd be a better history teacher today than I was, at 23 when I first got into the game.
Me too, because I didn't know any of this too. I mean, I'll share a story because both of you are principals. I think you'll enjoy this story. So in our local, we have a school, local K-6 school that always has had a very good reputation, gets good scores. Florida, you can argue one way or the other what that means, right? But it's Florida. I'm just kidding. It's a really solid school. Well, the name of the school for 80 years was J.J. Finley. Now, J.J. Finley was a Confederate general. And so the school is named after him in 1930. And 2 summers ago, the chair of the NAACP in our county called me and said, Paul, two points for you right now. Number one, you've just been delegated the position of official historian of the Alachua County NAACP. I'm like, okay, what does that entail? Well, it entails we want you to do a study on J.J. Finley to tell us if a school should be named after this man. Well, I already kind of knew the answer.
Right.
But I did some research. I looked into law books because he was a judge and everything. And it took me just a few days. And I got back with the NAACP and I said, look, this was a bad man. He was a bad man. I mean, even his own people said, this guy is a bad dude, and I don't know how on earth the school was named after him, much less 80 years. So, but one good turn deserves another. So after I wrote this brief, they said, okay, now you got to be in the renaming committee. So as you can imagine, as school administrators, the politics for that renaming committee were very complicated and fraught because because our first thought on the committee was, it was named after a bad white man for 80 years. What about naming after like a good Black person? Or someone who actually deserves to have their name in a school. And right away we had resistance. People were like, no, don't make the same mistake, Paul. Name it after a river. Name it after a forest or a tree. Wouldn't that be more neutral? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I want to name the school after a river or a tree,
And what does neutrality do? How is being neutral in something like this? Where does that even get us?
So here's the outcome. I'll bore you with I'll skip the long story. The outcome was we found a brilliant African-American female scientist, Carolyn Beatrice Parker. She had grown up in Gainesville during segregation, was never given opportunities educationally, brilliant mathematician. She had to go away to go to school. She came back with an MA and taught science in Gainesville and during the Great Depression, Gainesville, Florida, the town I'm talking about from now. During World War II, she was so brilliant as a scientist that she was recruited to work on the Manhattan Project.
Wow.
And that's how smart she was. And she was earning her PhD, but she died shortly after World War II of leukemia.
No.
Most of the people that worked in her lab in the Manhattan Project died of leukemia, probably because of exposure to radioactivity, right? So anyway, we fought a struggle to make sure that we named the school after Carolyn Parker, and it's Carolyn Parker Elementary to this day. And the young African-American, teachers and actually the office manager that works in the oral history program I direct has 2 children in that school. And she said one of the joyous days of her life as a Black mother was when her two children came to her and said, "Mommy, why was the school renamed?" Because the teachers didn't tell her initially. Who is Carolyn Parker? And a Black mother was able to tell her Black daughters, hey, Carolyn Parker was a Black scientist in the 30s and 40s, and we can aspire to, to be, it was kind of anything we can do kind of thing. And, people like me take that for granted. I'm almost 60 years old at this point, but when I heard that story, I was like, oh my gosh, there's a lot at stake here. Yeah. And sometimes we forget how important these things are.
Definitely. So Paul, you've kind of referenced it, the idea that you too went through a growing experience, right? I think we sometimes, even as young administrators and folk who are aspiring to be world changers and leaders in the movement of equity, diversity, and inclusion, sometimes we want to be able to get there, right? And we're actually going to start on a book and all these different things, right? But you didn't just jump to a book, right? You were once a history student in college. You were once a beginning history professor. And we heard you give a keynote speech, and you talked a little bit about how much you learned even from your students who began to say, listen, whatever you thought they were doing, here's what it means in our country, right? What that war meant, or what. Can you talk a little bit about that journey? Because when I think about history professors, I tend to think of older white men. However, I will say my very first Black male teacher I had when I was 21, it was a professor named Conrad Hamilton at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. And he was half Black, half Japanese. And he told the story that his mother and his father had to move to or go to another state to get married because there were still anti-miscegenation laws on the books. I think they were in Oregon, so they had to go to Washington to get married. But I'll often tell the story of just sitting and being enamored with this professor who for the first time looked like me, right? And what that meant to me. So can you talk a little bit about your journey to becoming the Paul Ortiz who gets his book banned?
Right. Well, I think a lot of that has to do, again, Maurice, with how we kind of grew up. And, in a society that was very violent, and there was just a lot of death, but the death was connected to different wars. And just having this sense of growing up and realizing, I was on my way into the military, and then, realizing at a certain point, why did this happen? Why do we have to continue on with this cycle? And I guess, especially being in Central America and seeing the devastation that I was a part of inflicting, in retrospect, it would have been much better if I'd have went down there with books or anything other than what I went down there with, which was guns. But, I grew up in a gun culture. I grew up in a very violent culture where, you solve your problems with force, lethal force. And it's not machismo. It's not a Black thing. It's not a Mexican thing. It's an American thing. And I'll tell you, one of my big wake up calls, which was an epiphany, it was actually my very last day in the military. And I still don't know how this happened, but any veteran there knows that phrase, hurry up and wait. And so I was in the hurry up and wait phase on my last day in the military. I was in Panama City on my way to get onto a C-130 flight to Miami and then get back, someplace in the US. And so I had some time to wait. And so I walked across the street to the small post library. And I went through, I always love to read. And I found a very thin book. I thought, I'll have time to read through this, because I have a couple hours to kill. So I started reading this book. And to this day, I have no idea how it was I picked up this book, because I didn't see the title, but I'm reading through this book and I'm like, this is the most remarkable thing I've ever read in my life. And these passages were things like, our people have suffered for 350 years. We've been patient, and you've asked us to wait. You've asked us to, you told us you'll take care of the problem, but we're not going to wait anymore. And we're going to use this thing called nonviolent civil disobedience. And it just blew me away. I'm like, what is that? I never heard of it in my entire life. The idea of nonviolence. And it was like it might as well have been in hieroglyphics. I mean, I'm reading this, I'm like, what? I mean, 350 years, If we had a problem like that, we'd pick up a gun and sort it out where I grew up. And this man was talking about doing things peacefully, but not in a pacifistic way, being aggressive, boycotts, fights, sit-ins, things like that. And I could tell, I didn't understand it. It took me many years, in fact, to understand the book. But by now, you know, I'm talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Letter from a Birmingham Jail. To me, that single book was the most important part of my journey into becoming a radical history professor. Another step was in high school. You know, Maurice alluded to being in high school, but I had an incredible Anglo teacher. His name was Don Bidwell, and he would put these books in your hands, and he would say, he tricked us. He talk about man books. He'd say, well, you know, you're not going to find this book in the school library. It's not going to be in the downtown public library. It's not going to be in a bookstore in Bremerton. You're going to have to go to Seattle to get it. Well, why, Mr. Bidwell? Well, it has some mature sequences in it, Paul. Like, it has some sex in it, maybe, and cussing. I'm like, I'm on the first ferry to Seattle, Washington to get that book. And I still have those books to this day. But that book that woke me up, I would think more than any single book in my life, Richard Wright's Native Son.
Yes.
That book, and I've talked to so many Chicano writers, Maurice and Lisette, in later years. I've given this lecture about the importance for us when we first encountered Richard Wright's Native Son, because it was a wake-up call. And it gave us the ability to go into, quote unquote, our own literature, to start reading Luis Rodriguez, Anaya, Carlos Fuentes, et cetera, because Wright taught us about systemic racism. He taught us the problem wasn't us. He taught us, stop hating yourself. This is a much bigger problem, and uses the character of Bigger Thomas to point this out. I think a lot of people misunderstand that character, but to me, I'm like, wow, I need to stop hating myself. And I remember crying reading that book as a high school student,
Yep.
because even though it was based in a different time, in a different place, in a different community than I grew up, I'm like, wow, I understood for the first time the problems that I was growing up weren't my fault. It was the world I was growing up in that was corrupt, not me, not the children. And so, Wright, you know, it was just such an incredible, and now it didn't stop me from going in the Army. And so, like I said, I don't think we have these epiphanies all at once. I think now that I'm 58 years old, I can see the stepping stones. Richard Wright's Native Son, Luis Rodriguez's, you know, Never Stop Running, Dr. King's, you know, Letter from Birmingham Jail, meeting Dolores Huerta, working in the movement. All of those things, for me, were stepping stones. And the big takeaway, though, was honor our elders, our ancestors in struggle, realize that we're not where we are now. I mean, we couldn't even have this conversation in 1776. We'd all be working in a field.
Right.
You know, we'd all be working in the back, you know, for the man. And so how is it that we have a relative degree of freedom that our ancestors did not have? Well, they fought for it and they bled for it.
Mm-hmm. So I want to jump into your book directly, because there's an article that just came out that LULAC is looking to protest, right? Or organizing a protest tomorrow, I believe, at the Texas Capitol. And your book is on that list. They're protesting, against banned books. And can you tell us a little bit about that? And what has been the reception that your book has received on both sides?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, it's really humbling because Libro Traficante, which is a group that came into being to fight the banning of Mexican-American studies in Tucson Unified in Arizona.
Yeah,
they're taking my book, but then a bunch of other books, especially books on gender and sexuality, LGBT, trans issues, and they're going to take our books and they're buying them and they're going to be distributing them in areas where these books are being banned. And so I've got a lot of reports because I have a lot of former students who teach in Texas. That's where a lot of my people live. And they've said, yeah, your book, I think the last school district, the San Antonio Unified, or one of the big chunks of the San Antonio school district, has just taken an African-American Latinx history off of its shelves and out of circulation. And what they've said is that, and it's interesting, I can't tell you how many workshops I've done and signings and lectures. And the amazing thing, Lisette, is that there's so many younger people that have taken this book and they've just adopted it. And they've said, this, you may have written the book, but this book belongs to me. And I'm like, wow, that's really cool. That's really cool. But because we have a lot of older people in the society, the ruling class people who want to hold on to power, they see like gender and sexuality studies as threats. They see critical race theory as threats. And so there's been, on the one hand, an incredible support for the book. But on the other hand, I've had people, it's interesting, is I've had people tell me that when they read the book, I've often heard the phrase, as a white person, someone will tell me, as a white person, your book really made me feel bad at first. And we'll talk about that. That even becomes a discussion in a group setting. As a white person, your book made me feel bad. And so I've said, well, let's kind of break that down, because I'm not here to judge people. I make it very clear. I came, I was a soldier. I fought, I was an imperial soldier. So I have no right to judge people based on my own experiences. So I want to find out, I've tried to work with people who say that as a white person, it makes me feel bad by asking them, well, why does it make you feel bad? Let's kind of break that down. Well, it makes me feel bad because I see how my ancestors were involved in oppression. I've said, well, were all your ancestors involved in oppression? And again, getting them to think about the differences between people who, were radical white abolitionists, and, definitely had flaws, but so did Frederick Douglass, my gosh. And so why not have us learn, we call them allies, right? I'm not sure if I call Thomas Paine an ally. He was a straight up, straight shooting freedom fighter, right? But why couldn't we have our allies identify with the people, let's say in the South now, let's pretend we're in Texas or Florida. If you're a white person today, you don't have to identify with the slave owning class in Florida or Texas. You could identify with the white people, if you want to do that, who were opposed to slavery. And they were the majority of the society. Or you could identify with the white people who supported Black Reconstruction in the 1860s and 1870s. And some of them were assassinated in Florida and in Texas. So I guess it's a kind of a complicated response, because on the one hand, it seems like there's an age thing. And so a lot of younger people have just picked up this book, and actually Beacon Press is working on a young adult edition right now, because
that's wonderful.
Because so many teachers are saying, yeah, we love using a chapter here, a chapter there, but unless it's kind of 11th, 12th grade students, they really need something a little, with pictures and more accessible kind of thing. And so there's teachers working on that right now. So there's kind of these dichotomies. On the one hand, I just see kids all over the country are in an uproar and about a whole lot of issues. Like, we just had a lot of students in Florida walk out of their classes en masse because of our so-called Don't Say Gay bill. I mean, we had dozens of schools. The media didn't report on what was really happening, because I just think that a lot of adults were fearful, because they had never seen, they thought, oh, we finally got the Black Lives Matter movement kind of bottled up here, because there are a lot of students walking out in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement here. A lot of students walking out in solidarity with kids involved in victims of school shootings. Here's one anecdote. I was giving a workshop with high school kids in a large high school in the Central Coast of California after one of the big school shootings in Florida. And we were meeting, and I asked them, and they had read a couple chapters, 95% Chicano kids. And they had read a couple chapters of African-American Latinx history in the United States. And I said, well, what did you read before that book that made a big impact on you? And they said, oh, this book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Wow, that's really cool. Why did it make an impact on you? And these are 11th, grade Chicano kids, first generation immigrants, most of them. from Mexico. And they said, well, here's the interesting thing about that book, Professor Ortiz. It talks about these white people, these Jews, these Poles, these Lithuanians being oppressed in these terrible working conditions. Every night at our kitchen table, we hear the same stories that we read about happening in 1905 or happening in 2020. And we have a question for you. When is this going to end? And I'm like, you just began the discussion. That's the most important discussion we can possibly have. But then after that, they kind of took me aside and they say, hey, don't tell anyone, but we're organizing a walkout in support of your high school students who were subjected to that terrible school shooting a few years ago. But don't tell anyone, but we want to get your ideas. We know you're an organizer. How should we organize this? And I said, number one, I'm not going to tell you how to organize. You got it done, but I am going to give you one piece of advice. Have your news release ready to go before the action, because the adults who run the media are going to try to make it appear as if you're walking out because you just want to get out of school and you're lazy and you're trifling. And I said, that's the same thing they did in '68 against the Chicano blowout kids.
Yep.
They did it against ethnic studies students in San Francisco State, in Cornell, et cetera, et cetera. So have your media ready to go. And then, in fact, a few days later, they walked out and they had a beautiful news release. This is why we're walking out. We're not walking out to avoid classes. In fact, we're willing to pay the price of detention for missing class. But we want to make it clear that gun violence has to end. And if the adults won't deal with it, we'll deal with it. So I was like, wow. And this is what so many people, Lisette, Maurice, are afraid of. And so my book is just a little part of this revolution that's happening, I believe, that's really at the high school level. And people like Ron DeSantis and Abbott in Texas, they're afraid. And so they're doing these draconian types of lashing out. But I think in the end, we're going to win.
You know what, I do too. I was just going to say that. I'm glad you said that, because so often, if anything, banning your book, I think, is going to increase its popularity, because I too remember sitting in an AP literature class in high school, and the teacher would do the same thing, like, we're about to read these books, but these are banned books, or they'd give us a list, and it actually engaged us that much more. And I'm also thrilled to hear that your book is going to be made into like a kids version or a young adult version. Is that what you said?
Yeah, they call it YA. It's a whole thing now.
Yeah.
A lot of, because, like Ibram Kendi's.
I was going to say,
that's what I was about to say.
I was just about to say.
Yeah, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, she's one of my mentors. Her Indigenous Peoples History has been made into a YA edition. Kids are
one of my teachers is reading it, reading Stamped for Kids. And it has completely changed the conversation in her classroom. And she's only a 5th grade teacher. But even like the kids started questioning, like, why is Abraham Lincoln on our money? And they just are, it's really beautiful to see. And I agree. I think young people will help us win in the end. It always has been young people.
It has. Yeah. I mean, and they just need some, a few of us old timers, and just to listen. The big thing is just listening. I mean, when I do teachers, like I just did a teachers workshop with teachers, and I love going to Connecticut. I just have to admit to you. Because Connecticut is one of those places which has been the site of a sustained Black and brown student movement, a lot of Afro-Latino students. And watching them, you can find some of their testimony on YouTube, where 3 or 4 years ago they would get up in front of these kind of almost like moribund legislators, and you're like, oh, here we go again. Do we have to relive the '60s every day? But these kids,
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, right. And middle school, high school kids are saying, they were protesting for the right to read more. They're asking for requirements. Make it into a requirement. And, this, as an educator, this thrilled me, because when I first started as a professor, I would get invited by school districts to help implement elective curriculum. around, people of color, histories, And then over the past 5 or 8 years, I've seen a new trend. I've talked to a lot of assistant superintendent types, and they've said, Paul, what we're doing now does not work. And I'm working with a school district in Maryland, for example, that services about 200,000 children, K through 12. And the assistant superintendent said, Paul, I'm just so tired of walking through my classes and my social studies classes and seeing the kids with their heads in their desks. I realized our curriculum is outmoded. It's George Washington, it's old Hamilton. It's the same, she said, I'll cuss, she said, it's the same crap when I was learning how to be a teacher, 40 years ago.
Right.
And she said, do you have people of color that you can put into the curriculum for these kids? And I'm like, the doctor's in.
Yeah.
Do I have people for you?
I?
What decade do you want? What language do you want them speaking? Where do you want them to be from? And so to me, and it's interesting. I'll stay in this one school district, which will remain nameless for the time being, but I got a chance to work with the superintendent over a long period of time. Now it's funny for me. I'm going to have to admit something to y'all who are principals. This is embarrassing for me. I was a terrible student in public school. Awful.
So was I.
Yeah. I spent more time, K through 4. I spent more time in the principal's office than I did in my classroom for a number of reasons, which we'll not go into now. But this assistant superintendent, who I got to know really well before she retired, after working with her about 3 years, and it wasn't anything I did. I would just go to the summer trainings and spend a day with the teachers. And I'll never forget one of them. We were working on they were building a curriculum around chapter 4 of African American Latinx history, the Cuban Solidarity Movement, because they had a lot of students from the Caribbean moving into this kind of Eastern Shore school district. And they wanted curriculum that they'd be able to recognize, place names, countries. And it was a hot summer day in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and air conditioning went out. And I thought, well, we're not going to be here very long. And but because I lived in places without air conditioning, it didn't bother me. But sweat was pouring out, and not a single teacher left. Not a single teacher asked to leave. They were like, let's stay on the plan. The end of that session, the assistant superintendent comes up to me, and remember, she's the assistant superintendent of a school district that services 200,000 children. And she says, Paul, and this was after the Black Lives Matter movement resurgence in the spring of 2020. And she said, Paul, you know something? I never would have said this my entire life, but I'm almost 70 years old. And I think what this society needs now more than ever is a revolution. What do you think? I was like, wow. Yeah, I guess I think we do need a revolution. I didn't expect you to tell me we needed a revolution.
Good for her.
Yeah, it was just amazing to see so many people from unexpected places. I mean, I never would have thought Connecticut would be like at the center
it's
of the
so
ethnic
interesting.
studies movement.
Yeah, I keep thinking like Connecticut. Our Secretary of Education is from Connecticut, right? Miguel Cardona.
There's all
He's also from Connecticut. I guess I never thought, look at my ignorance, I never really thought about that area of having such a large Latino population. And
the Puerto Rican diaspora there is really strong.
In Connecticut?
In Connecticut.
Wow.
And a lot of independence-minded elders whose kids live there now. And Puerto Rico, of course, has this vibrant, it's not a left-right thing. They still have people who are anarchists, socialists, people who are in different left tendencies. And we're working, I'm working now with the teachers who are working with those kids, who are their grandkids. And they have fire in them. Mm-hmm. And it's like when for years I've taught about the Chicano blowout in 1968, Oregon ethnic studies struggles in the West Coast or in the Northeast, and colleges in the early 70s. And I've got to say, I think there's more momentum now among younger people than I've ever seen. I mean, that first spring after the Black Lives Matter movement came out, And let's, I just want to be clear. I mean, the success of African-American Latinx in the US is due primarily to the younger people we're talking about now, and especially the Black Lives Matter movement. My first Hispanic Heritage Month after the resurgence of Black Lives Matter blew up. I mean, it was incredible. I had 3 times as many gigs as I had the prior Hispanic Heritage Month. And it was Latino organizations in like South Chicago, East LA, Hialeah, Florida, Miami, West Palm, South Bronx. And 2/3 of them were asking me, Paul, we want a Hispanic Heritage Month presentation where you center the issue of anti-Black racism, because we've got to deal with this in our communities. What do you think? And that only became possible because of the movement, because of so many people in motion and beginning to connect the dots. Okay, well, a young Black man was gunned down by the police or brutalized by the police. Oh, well, did you know that a Chicano kid, the same thing happened to him, and nothing was heard about it? So how can we? And then again, the literature, you both alluded to the importance of that literature. So when my students read Junot Diaz, even if they've never been part of a movement, they're reading about a writer who's talking about anti-Blackness within the Dominican diaspora. And how are we going to deal with this? Because we can't continue to allow this to destroy and undermine our families. Because when we talk about Black and Brown tensions, let's be clear, it's not about Black and Brown tensions between 3rd Avenue and 5th Avenue. It's within our own families. Yeah. It's phenotype, hairstyle, hair type, nose shape within our own families. And this is a legacy of Spanish and Portuguese and British and Dutch and French imperialism, because for centuries, that's how we moved it through the empire. Mm-hmm. And to think that we're somehow going to just jettison that is ridiculous, and that's what I think, you know what I mean? And so I think that's where the literature is so very important. And what you all are doing is really at the forefront.
Yes.
Yeah. So man, so much I would respond. And I'll just say a couple of things, and then Paul, we're going to let you go. We're not going to keep you here all night. We're going to wrap things up here in just a moment. But I did take a class. It was a 300 level Spanish class. And I remember it was all in Spanish, and it was super hard. And it was called Afroidentidad y Hispanidad. And it was about the African diaspora throughout the Latin American world. And we learned about pigmentocracia, and we learned about blanqueando la raza, right? Like this idea of whitening the race, that you married lighter so that you could, I mean, to the point that I had a student in my building come to me and say, well, Mr. McDavid, this kid is calling me Black, and he called me the N-word. Like, that's 2022 that we're still engaging in some of these conversations. So now he's talking to his Black bilingual principal. And I said, is there something wrong with being Black? And he, oh, no. In fact, I think it's cool. And I think he was telling the truth, right? but at the same time, even though he thought it was cool, there was something in his mind that said, okay, but I don't necessarily want to be actually Black, right? So I think that's definitely a whole nother piece that we could definitely jump onto. But I wanted to ask you just kind of this question. Normally we let our guests close us out with like just a final thought, but this was a question that we had kind of talked about, and you've kind of alluded to it earlier. But I think it's a good one for you as we look at your book. If you had to replace a founding father, right? Like if you had to make a case for like, okay, and maybe it's Hamilton, right? Let's say we're going to take Hamilton out and you're going to replace that founding father with an equally important or perhaps more important person of color from our history, from that time period or maybe later on. Who is that person? Who's the replacing founding father, and why? And we'll close on that note.
Oh my gosh, how many hours do we have, man? I
Hey, we might have to do a part two with you. I mean, this is
mean,
incredible. I can listen to you for hours, to be honest.
well, I mean, I think, Mariah Stewart comes to mind. I mean, she was an early African-American female abolitionist who was such a powerful orator. We just have a few of her speeches extant. She wowed audiences. She made men, by the way, feel very uncomfortable because they're like, black women in the 1810s and 20s speaking up. I also think of someone like Lemuel Haynes, who is in African-American Latinx history. I mean, I just stumbled across him. I mean, he's this young African descent man who picks up a gun and he fights in the Green Mountain Boys in the American Revolution. And the minute that Jefferson's Declaration of Independence is being promulgated, and we're always taught to see that as this incredibly inspirational story, as the Declaration is moving around the colonies and people are reading it and like, what is this idea about liberty and stuff? Lemuel Haynes is a young black man. He's already shouldered a weapon for the cause. And his first response is, well, this is some nonsense. I'm going to put a halt to this right now, because I want to let you know that this can't happen the way you're saying it's going to happen unless you abolish slavery, like right now. And so, Lemuel Haynes would be one person. And then again, I think, let's bring someone from Mexico, Jose Morelos, and because he's in direct contact with President James Madison. And he's saying, we are patterning in part our revolution on your revolution, but we think we're a little more advanced because we're abolishing slavery. But let's get together, because that the Europeans are going to come after us. They just burned down your capital, by the way. The British did in the War of 1812. But if we formed an alliance between Mexico and the US, you have so much to teach us. We have so much to teach you. So in Mexico, Morelos is seen, of course, as one of the founding fathers. So I would say, hey, let's switch out one of the, I won't name a name. You name a name. I won't name a name. Let's do the trade, right? I think Dave Chappelle had the lottery, the racial lottery.
Yes, the racial draft.
Yeah, the racial draft. And so I know that's not politically correct, but let's pick. I would pick Morelos. Let's take Morelos, and then you all could have like U.S. could give away, I don't know, someone. But and then also let's not forget, again, people like Thomas Paine. The other day, a right-wing person invoked the pamphlet Common Sense, but they made Sam Adams, I think, the author of it. I'm like, what? Obviously, you haven't read that, have you? Because Thomas Paine was against slavery. He was against the abuse of women. He was for the rights of working people before the revolution. And so let's give props to those folks too.
Awesome.
Wait, which one would you replace though? Like, would you swap out? Like, Alex, would it be Hamilton? Who would it be?
Yeah, I'd swap out Hamilton because he hated indigenous people, y'all. I mean, I hate, I know that President Obama and everyone loved, Hamilton and everything. I love the soundtrack, but when you look into this man's history, it's very sketchy, very sketchy.
Dang it, man. Dang it.
Hey, he was sketchy in the musical. So he was. Let's be real.
I mean, clearly morally corrupt and yeah. So.
Yeah, and he probably just had I don't know how tall he was, but almost like a complex, a little man complex or something. I don't know.
I mean, I would take someone from later too. I mean, again, if you think of someone who, I mean, I would take, this is counterfactual in a way, but I mean, Ida B. Wells Barnett was smarter than any one of those people we've been talking about. I mean, she had it going. And again, she was so dangerous that at one point, she had almost every white man in the city of Memphis, Tennessee, armed after her, wanting to shoot her down, because the truth that she was putting out there about racial violence was so incendiary and so truth-telling. The white power structure, the entire South, said, we've got to do something about this black woman. We got to take her out, and that's why she ends up in Chicago, for so many years. But there's been so many brilliant black women at, and then again in the Chicana movement, I mentioned Dolores Huerta. I mean, my students were so blown away by her, because I said, all I had to do is say, well, she was 93 or just turned 94. And right away, my students are like, oh, she's like a great grandma type. She came here and blew them away.
She's a doll.
They're like, how could she be in their 90s? She's still articulate, one of them said. Like, yeah. And they said, she's more radical than anyone we've ever heard in our lives, just because she connects our struggles together. And I guess that's the thing I'd like, if you're asking us to kind of, I hate to close the conversation, but that's what I learned in the movement was people teaching us how to connect dots, avoiding the kind of the oppression Olympics kind of thing, but saying, hey, how can we get free together? That was something. And especially if you look, again, women at the forefront, the Tita Martinez, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. I mean, they were heavily involved in the early 70s. And when you look at what they were writing in those underground feminist and Chicana journals, especially, they're writing about, it's the women who are saying, we've got to get free together. And they're at the forefront of it. And they're like, and that's all there is to it.
Oh, love it. But I don't know if the founding fathers deserve more.
Right.
Dirty dogs. Well, it's been a pleasure having you. I feel like we could go on, and I feel like I'm walking away. I'm like taking notes of like, oh, I need to look up this person or that person.
I've got tabs open. Name that you put. Let me go read up on them.
Yes. But for our listeners, and if you're watching on YouTube, here is the cover. Definitely a great read. Thank you. Honestly, just thank you for writing this. Because I grew up in a community where Black and brown people were together, and yet I noticed some of the rubs against each other, against each other's community. But it was so beautiful to see this. So thank you so much, seriously, for putting this work together.
Thank you.
It's great.
Thanks for inviting me on your wonderful program. Really appreciate it.
Yes, and hopefully we'll be in touch. So for Black, Brown, and Bilingual, I'm Lisette Jacobson.
And I'm Maurice McDavid.
Muchas gracias for tuning in.
Adios.